The first time I saw one of their shirts hanging over my fence, I honestly didn't think twice about it. It was a gray college t-shirt, still dripping water onto the grass behind my patio, and I remember standing there barefoot with a cup of coffee thinking, well, laundry falls sometimes. When happens? No reason to turn into the angry neighbor over a wet shirt. So I picked it up, tossed it back over the fence, and went on with my morning. Looking back now, that was probably the exact moment I accidentally gave them permission. Because 2 days later, there was a towel hanging there. Not blown over. Not tangled by accident. Hanging. Neatly spread across the top rail, like somebody had taken their time with it. And that's the thing about little boundary violations. They almost always start small enough that you feel stupid reacting to them. My name's Ryan, and at the time I was living in this narrow little row house neighborhood outside Tacoma, Washington, one of those places where every backyard practically touches the next one and everybody pretends to be friendly while secretly keeping score of each other's lives. My fence backed up against the yard of a family named the Delgados. Nice enough people on the surface. Loud kids, always a grill going. Music every weekend, lots of cousins coming through. Their backyard looked like a constant family reunion. And honestly, I didn't hate them. In fact, when I first moved in, Carmen Delgado brought over banana bread and introduced herself like we were starring in some wholesome suburban commercial. But over time, I started noticing this weird thing about her husband, Victor. He had this casual way of treating shared space like it belonged to him. If his trash cans rolled near your driveway, they stayed there. If his guests parked halfway in front of your mailbox, that was suddenly your problem to solve. Little things. Always little things. Just enough to make you feel petty for noticing. And then came the laundry. At first it was random pieces. Socks. A kid's Spider-Man shirt. A pair of jeans hanging halfway into my yard like they were enjoying the view. Then one afternoon I walked outside and found a full bedsheet stretched across 2 entire fence panels behind my patio furniture. I actually stopped and stared at it for a second because it looked so ridiculous, like my backyard had somehow become part of their laundry room without anyone informing me. The craziest part was how comfortable they seemed with it. No apology, no hesitation, just complete confidence that this was fine. I remember my friend Nate coming over one Saturday to watch the Mariners game, and halfway through grilling burgers he goes, "Dude, are those your pants?" while pointing at a pair of floral pajama bottoms hanging over the fence behind us. And I laughed because what else are you supposed to do at first? But deep down, it got under my skin more than I wanted to admit. Because your home is supposed to feel like the one place where the outside world stops pressing against you. I'd bought that house after a brutal divorce, after months of sleeping in a studio apartment that smelled like old carpet and microwave dinners. That backyard mattered to me. It was the first place in years that felt peaceful. I rebuilt the deck myself. Strung warm patio lights across the corner posts. Planted herbs along the fence line, even though I kept forgetting to water them. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. So every time I stepped outside and saw strangers' laundry swaying over my yard, it felt weirdly personal, like somebody slowly moving into your head 1 inch at a time. Still, I didn't want drama. Neighborhood fights are miserable because there's no escape from them. You can't clock out from bad blood when the person lives 15 feet away. So one evening while Victor was outside flipping burgers, I decided to handle it like an adult. I walked over near the fence and said, "Hey man, quick favor. Would you mind not hanging stuff over this side anymore? It's starting to get a little awkward when people come over." He looked at me for maybe 2 seconds too long before smirking and saying, "Come on, Ryan, it's just laundry. Sometimes things spill over." Spill over. I remember that phrase exactly because he said it like I was being uptight for even bringing it up. Then he laughed a little and added, "Not like we're building a garage over there." And I forced a laugh too because that's what people do when they're trying to keep the peace even while feeling disrespected. But later that night, sitting alone on my patio listening to somebody's dog bark 3 houses down, I realized something that bothered me even more than the laundry itself. Victor knew exactly what he was doing. And somehow that made the whole thing feel less accidental and a whole lot more deliberate. After that conversation, things actually got worse, just slowly enough that I kept second-guessing myself. That's the dangerous part about people like Victor. They rarely come at you directly. They test how much space they can take before you finally push back. A week after we talked, I walked outside early on a Sunday morning with my coffee and found 3 tiny baby shirts clipped neatly along the top of my fence like colorful little flags. Not blown there. Clipped there. On my side. I just stood there staring at them while the coffee cooled in my hand. And I remember feeling this weird mix of anger and embarrassment because it suddenly felt intentional in a way it hadn't before. Like he wasn't just using the fence anymore. He was making a point. I tossed the shirts back over without saying anything. But from then on I started noticing everything. Every little interaction felt loaded. Victor would wave at me with this relaxed smile, like we were buddies, while one of his towels hung 3 feet behind my grill. His kids would run along the fence line and laugh while pulling clothespins off the wood. One afternoon, Carmen actually reached over into my yard to grab a bedsheet while I was sitting outside reading. She froze when she saw me there, gave this awkward little smile, and said, "Oh, sorry, didn't know you were out here." And that sentence stuck with me all night, because what did she mean she didn't know I was out there? It was my backyard. But that's how these situations work sometimes. People normalize crossing lines until your reaction becomes the strange thing instead of the behavior itself. The truth is, I probably would have kept tolerating it if my sister hadn't come over that next weekend. Emily was brutally honest in a way only older sisters can be. She walked into the backyard, looked at a giant comforter hanging over the fence, and immediately said, "Ryan, why does it look like your yard lost custody of itself?" I laughed harder than I should have because she was right. Then she got serious. "You know this isn't normal, right?" And I remember shrugging and saying, "I just don't want neighborhood drama." She looked at me for a second and said something that honestly changed the way I saw the whole thing. Avoiding conflict and surrendering your boundaries are not the same thing. That line stayed in my head for days. Because deep down, she wasn't just talking about the fence. Ever since the divorce, I'd become this version of myself that constantly avoided friction. At work, with family, with neighbors. I let things slide because I was exhausted from conflict. My ex-wife used to say I'd rather quietly resent something for 10 years than risk one uncomfortable conversation. And standing there staring at somebody else's laundry hanging over my patio, I realized maybe she wasn't entirely wrong. So I tried one more polite step before doing anything drastic. I ordered a small black metal sign online. Simple, clean, nothing aggressive. "Please do not hang items on fence." I mounted it near the shared section one evening after work, and honestly, for about a week, it worked. The fence stayed clear. No towels, no socks, no random superhero underwear dancing in the breeze behind my patio chairs. For the first time in months, the yard felt calm again. Then came Friday night. I had a couple co-workers over after work, just burgers and beer out back, and right in the middle of one story my friend Claire suddenly stopped listening and looked behind me. She said carefully, trying not to laugh. "Is that normal?" I turned around and there it was. A massive floral bedsheet clipped directly underneath the sign. I'm not kidding. Directly underneath it. Like somebody had gone out of their way to make sure I saw it. Everybody got quiet for a second. Then one of my co-workers awkwardly joked, "Guess they disagreed with your policy." I laughed along because what else could I do? But inside something finally snapped. Not explosive anger. Honestly, it was colder than that. Clearer. Because in that moment, I understood this was never about laundry space. Victor didn't need my fence. He needed the feeling that he could ignore me without consequences. Some people push boundaries because they're careless. Others do it because your silence makes them feel powerful. And once I realized that, the solution became obvious. I stopped thinking about how to convince him to respect me and started thinking about how to remove the opportunity entirely. The next morning, I drove to a hardware supply store about 20 minutes away and spent almost an hour walking the fencing aisle pretending I knew what I was looking for. An older employee named Frank eventually asked if I needed help, and after hearing the story he laughed so hard he had to lean against a shelf. "So basically," he said, "your neighbor turned your fence into a community laundromat." Then he pointed me toward these rounded vinyl fence caps designed to protect wood from rain damage. Smooth surface. Slight curve. No grip whatsoever. The second I touched one, I knew it would work. And the beauty of it was how harmless it looked. No confrontation. No cameras. No angry notes. Just physics. That whole Sunday became weirdly therapeutic. I sanded the fence edge, cleaned the wood, measured each section carefully while classic rock played from my old Bluetooth speaker. For the first time in months, I felt in control of my own space again. Around sunset, Victor stepped outside while I was securing the last section. He leaned against his grill holding a beer and called over, "What's all that?" I looked down the fence line before answering casually. Just weather protection. Wood was starting to wear down. He nodded slowly. Looks expensive. Cheaper than replacing the fence later, I said. Then came this long little silence where I could feel him trying to figure out whether there was a hidden message in what I was saying. The funny part is, there absolutely was. He just couldn't prove it. The first attempt happened 2 days later. I know because I was inside working from home when I heard this soft, sliding noise outside my office window. I peeked through the blinds and almost laughed out loud. A damp blue towel was slowly inching its way down the curved fence cap, like a cartoon character slipping off a roof. 3 seconds later, it disappeared completely back onto their side. Then came Victor's voice. Are you kidding me? I nearly choked trying not to laugh. Later that afternoon, another shirt appeared, then slid off, then socks, then a bedsheet that lasted maybe 10 glorious seconds before collapsing backward into their yard in one giant heap. I never said a word. That was the best part. There was nothing to argue about. The fence wasn't damaged. Their clothes weren't ruined. Gravity was simply no longer cooperating with entitlement. And over the next week, something fascinating happened. The attempts became less frequent. The confidence disappeared. That casual ownership they developed over my fence started crumbling because for the first time, using my space required effort instead of assumption. Then one evening, right as the sun was dropping behind the rooftops, Victor finally brought it up. He was outside alone folding laundry from a basket when he looked over the fence and said, "Ever since you put those things up, nothing stays anymore." I looked up from trimming one of my herb plants and said calmly, "Yeah, they're pretty slick." He stared at me for a second like he wanted to say something sharper, but there was nowhere for the conversation to go. Because technically, I hadn't done anything to him at all. Victor stood there for another few seconds holding a damp towel in both hands, almost like he was waiting for me to apologize for solving a problem he created. Then he gave this short little laugh through his nose and said, "Guess we'll need another clothesline." I nodded once and went back to clipping dead leaves off my basil plant like the conversation meant absolutely nothing. But inside, I can't lie, it felt incredible. Not because I won, and honestly not even because the laundry finally stopped showing up. It felt good because for the first time in a long time, I handled a problem without turning myself into either a doormat or a grenade. Somewhere along the way after my divorce, I'd convinced myself those were the only two options. Either swallow your frustration forever or explode and make everybody miserable. But standing there in the soft orange light with Victor awkwardly folding his towels on his own side of the fence, I realized there's actually a third option most people never talk about. Quietly making your boundaries impossible to ignore. No screaming. No revenge. No dramatic speeches. Just structure. Just consequences. And weirdly enough, after that, things between us got better. Not friendly exactly, but clearer. Cleaner. The tension disappeared because the argument itself disappeared. A few days later, I noticed they'd installed a second laundry line deeper into their yard. One of those retractable cable ones attached to 2 metal poles. It looked crowded and inconvenient compared to using my fence, but that wasn't really my problem anymore. The funny thing is, once the laundry stopped, I started noticing how peaceful my backyard actually was again. Small things. The sound of the wind moving through the cedar trees behind the alley. The way the patio lights reflected off my glass table at night. The fact that I could sit outside with a beer without staring at somebody else's sweatpants floating over my shoulder like a suburban ghost. One Friday evening, Nate came back over to watch another Mariners game, and halfway through grilling burgers, he looked around the yard and said, "Wow, your fence finally got custody back." I laughed so hard I almost dropped the spatula. But later that night, after he left and everything got quiet again, I sat alone outside thinking about how ridiculously small the whole situation sounded when you explained it out loud. It was just laundry. That's what made it dangerous. Because life almost never destroys your peace all at once. It happens slowly, through tiny repeated invasions you keep telling yourself aren't worth addressing. A parking spot. Noise. Borrowed tools that never come back. Little acts of disrespect people normalize because confronting them feels exhausting. And if you ignore enough of them long enough, eventually you wake up feeling like a guest in your own life. That realization hit harder than I expected, because the fence was never really the fence. It was every moment over the last few years where I stayed quiet to avoid discomfort while resentment quietly piled up behind my ribs. Even at work, I started noticing it. A coworker dumping his unfinished tasks onto me because he knew I wouldn't argue. Family members assuming I'd rearrange my holidays around their schedules. Tiny things that seemed harmless individually, but added up into this constant, invisible pressure of other people deciding my limits for me. And maybe that sounds dramatic over a laundry story, but honestly, I think a lot of people watching this probably know exactly what I mean. The strange part is, Victor and I actually had one final conversation about a month later that completely changed the way I saw him too. I was out front one evening bringing my trash bins back in when he walked over holding a beer. For a second, I thought maybe here comes the real confrontation, finally. But instead he leaned against his truck and said, "You know Carmen thought you hated us." That caught me off guard. I laughed a little and said, "I didn't hate you guys. I just wanted my fence back." He nodded slowly, staring down the street before saying something I honestly didn't expect. Where I grew up, everybody shared everything. Space, yards, tools, nobody cared. Guess I pushed that too far here. And just like that, the whole thing suddenly felt less cartoon villain and more human. Still disrespectful, sure. Still frustrating. But human. I told him, "Honestly, man, if you'd just asked first, I probably would have said yes once in a while." He laughed at that and shook his head. "Yeah, probably should have asked." Then we stood there awkwardly sipping our beers in silence, while somebody down the block started mowing their lawn at almost 8 o'clock at night, like a complete psychopath. And that was kind of it. No dramatic apology. No movie ending. Just two stubborn men finally understanding the thing they should have understood months earlier. Boundaries aren't rejection. They're communication. But I'll be honest. Part of me still wonders if Victor really learned that lesson, or if he only stopped because the fence physically stopped cooperating. And weirdly enough, that question still bothers me sometimes. Because if respect only exists when inconvenience exists, is it actually respect at all? Anyway, that's the story of how my backyard accidentally turned into a neighborhood laundromat, and how a $30 piece of vinyl probably saved me from becoming the angry guy yelling over a fence at sunset. But now I'm curious what you think. Was I too passive for waiting so long? Should I have confronted him harder from the start? Or was solving the problem quietly the smarter move? Let me know in the comments because honestly, I've told this story to friends before and people get weirdly divided over it. And if you've ever dealt with neighbors crossing boundaries in subtle ways, subscribe because trust me, suburban drama gets a lot stranger than this.